Okay, in this lecture, we're going to discuss two more aspects of dealing with deviance in our society. Uh, and that is, the first one would be defining, and we've already talked a little bit about this in an earlier one, the difference between street crime and, again, you may sometimes hear this debate, street crime versus corporate crime or street crime versus white collar crime. We're actually going to be a little more specific and actually talk about the concept of corporate violence because again, a lot of people when they're asked, okay, what's more important, street crime or corporate crime, people will say street crime because it usually contains some element of violence, robbery, assault, burglary, theft, taking something from someone. Whereas again, sometimes we think about the concept of white collar crime or corporate crime as being sometimes called non-violent. This concept of tax evasion or fraud. Now, that can certainly be an element to it, and when we definitely know, when we study these things criminally, we sometimes say, okay, street crime involves violence, white collar crime doesn't. Again, sometimes we're ignoring the scope of things. So a person mugging another person on the street, again, not to downplay the seriousness of that behavior, affects one person affecting another person. A person engaging in tax evasion affects the entire society. Earlier when we talked about wealth inequality, we talked about this concept of how much of society's wealth inequality could be addressed by the idea of people just paying their taxes, or fraud affecting hundreds of thousands people and sometimes billions of dollars in losses. So, but specifically, what we're going to talk about here is this idea of corporate violence. That not all these concepts of what we might call white collar crime don't involve an element of actual physical harm or damage to individuals. Again, critical constructionism asks ourselves, do we sometimes use social class and who a person is in society to determine how much harm they're doing to other people? Again, a lot of people speculate and make the case that corporate crime does more harm to people in society than does quote-unquote street crime. And again, there's a quote from your text that starts us off. An unreasonable risk of physical harm to employees, the public, and consumers, which is intended to benefit corporations themselves. So when we look at that unfettered, unregulated idea of corporations, that goal that corporations have of being told not being told what to do, being able to set their own standards, often results in actual physical harm to workers, the public, consumers in general. Again, a lot of times when from the critical constructionist point of view, we see these things being treated very differently in the criminal justice system. A lot of times when corporations engage in policies that result in physical harm or damage being done to individuals, it's not dealt with in criminal courts, but rather what we sometimes call civil or regulatory courts. So whereas if I were to go out and hit someone over the head and take their wallet, I'm guilty of obviously street crime, right? And I'm probably going to be prosecuted in a criminal court. Whereas some very famous examples, so the Ford Motor Company in the 1970s produced an automobile called the Ford Pinto. Many of you have ever heard of this. And the Pinto was designed with a very fatal flaw that again, I'm not going to turn this into an engineering class, but the fuel tank was positioned in the back of the vehicle, very close to the rear bumper. So if the Ford Pinto was involved in a rear-end collision, as we know many traffic accidents are, there was a very very high chance that the gas tank would explode uncontrollably and largely burn up the entire car along with anyone in it. So reports started coming in from the public, hey, Pintos involved in rear accidents are bursting into flame and the people inside them are dying, right? And Ford Manufacturer Company, had the option of issuing a recall, saying, okay, bring back all those cars, we're going to buy them back at a cost of, millions and millions of dollars to us. And basically what the Ford company did was, through insurance and other formulas, estimated the cost of a human life at being approximately $200,000. So actually put a sticker price, right? A human life is worth $200,000. And if we can estimate how much a recall will cost us as opposed to how many people are likely to die, and we'll have to pay out $200,000 per person, uh, the numbers came back that the recall was more expensive, and Ford did not issue one, and decided that they would gladly, if they were burned up in accidents, to pay out $200,000 a person. So there's an example of a time when corporate decisions are affecting people's physical lives. We definitely know that tobacco companies for a very long time had ample evidence that use of tobacco, smoking tobacco, was linked to heart and lung disease, and that nicotine is very addictive. Not only did those corporations deny a lot of those, but actually, suppressed a lot of science that would exemplify that. So, saying no and portrayed basically nicotine as non-addictive and that smoking as being a safe behavior to engage in. So again, why do we engage, and why do we regard street crime in a lot of cases as being more severe or dangerous to society than issues of corporate violence? And again, many critical constructionists will point to the idea of where's our information coming from? Where is this hegemony that we have that street crime equals violence and corporate misbehavior doesn't equal violence or shouldn't be treated the same way? That's many times, again, based on media that directs our attention more to street crime. Again, the interests of the upper class and the elite who lobby for corporate crime not to be treated criminally. And again, some people point to this idea of, okay, this is all conspiracy theory things. People don't have to act in concert, right? There doesn't have to be this group of people getting together to say, okay, we need to, make sure that this never happens. If one person is accused of something and they defend themselves by saying, I shouldn't be treated this way, other people who are accused of the same thing are going to react exactly the same way. So these are not overt conspiracies, but just the common interests of these groups to avoid being held accountable for their behavior. And the last topic we want to talk about is this concept of terrorism. Again, there's not a word in our society that kind of instantaneously produces this type of loathing, right? Again, this concept of we hear the word terrorist, we automatically go to bad, evil, awful. And again, this isn't me standing up for the rights of terrorists. This isn't me advocating that terrorism is an acceptable alternative. But again, looking at it from a critical construction point of view, who determines what constitutes terrorism and what doesn't? Again, we're socially constructed to understand that the use of violence to achieve political goals is terrorism, right? That this idea of if you are dissatisfied with society and you engage in some act of violence, you will probably be labeled a terrorist. Okay. However, again, if we look at this temporally across time, at one time we could probably say, based on our modern definitions of terrorism, that many of the American patriots who rebelled against British colonial rule would be considered terrorists. In fact, there's a quote from your text: "One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter." Right? So we regard American history as, legally, the colonies were the property of the British Empire and the King of England. Now you can say, well, that's, again, we're back to this idea of who determines what's legal and what's not legal. At that time, the King of England and the British Empire did, right? And those people who fought against that rule were breaking the law and would probably, by modern definitions, be considered terrorists. Typically, terrorists are defined usually by groups with an enormous amount of power against groups with very little power. And again, and when we talk about power, in this case, we're usually talking about military power. We're talking about the ability to impose force on other groups to get them to comply or to get them to follow the rules of the more powerful group. We've definitely seen times, again, we sometimes are often conditioned to think terrorism is not an effective way of dealing with things, and that's historically has not always been the case. The modern state of Israel was largely paved by acts that we would definitely consider terrorist against indigenous people of Palestine. Um, and that, quote unquote, worked. In what we call now the Troubles, the conflict between the Republic of Ireland, Southern Ireland, or Catholic Ireland, and Northern Ireland, Orange Ireland, or Protestant Ireland, were considered terrorism for a very long time. And the leaders of terrorist groups such as the IRA are often actually now considered political leaders in the country that is, well, we may see an inflammation of those problems again, um, considered political leaders after the violence ceases. So again, we're kind of, socially conditioned to this idea of terrorism. It's ineffective, and that's not always the case. Um, we often think about terrorism as violence directed toward innocents or civilians, okay? And that any group who does that is engaging in terroristic behavior. But we often then sometimes ignore what we would consider to be legal forms of war in which citizens or civilians are affected. Again, just to use a couple of examples of wars that the United States has been engaged in. In the Korean War, 84% of the casualties suffered in that military action were civilians. In Vietnam, 90% of the casualties that were suffered on both sides of that conflict were civilians. In all the wars fought between 1989 and the early part of the 21st century, about 75% of over 7 million victims were civilians. So it's not always the case of small groups attacking civilians, in which civilians are affected. It's oftentimes, again, the effects of nations engaging with each other in military behavior, which results in huge amounts of civilian casualties. Sometimes the distinction is made, okay, only if it's intentional, right? You can say, okay, well, when a terrorist sets off a bomb, he is, and I'll use the gender bias of males, but he is intentionally trying to affect civilians, whereas in war, civilians are affected unintentionally. And again, that's not correct. Again, in World War II, we saw, again, an Allied behavior, the firebombing of the city of Dresden in Germany. Again, the intention was to set the city on fire so it would burn to the ground. That is not to say that they're only targeting military, it was a civilian city. And clearly, the action that ended World War II, the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, those were not military targets. They had military, again, a lot of people won't say those were military targets. They were certainly important to the industrial complex of Japan, but there was no misconception that the majority of people who were going to be affected, killed by those atomic bombs were civilians. And again, so when we get back to this idea of critical constructionism in regard to terrorism, it's a term used by one side, usually the more powerful and sometimes victorious, to demonize the other side, and usually used as a way of justifying its own use of violence against citizens or civilians. Okay? So that gives us the information we now need to proceed to discussion board 8, which will be discussed in another video.